The next chapter is On the Rainy River. This is a chapter that does read like it could be a standalone story. It was not published before this book. It's the first time it was published was as part of this book. But I have seen teachers sometimes print it because I think you can now access just this chapter alone as if it were a standalone essay or short story. I have had some teachers who don't teach the entire book sometimes include this as part of their curriculum or have it sometimes pop up in a U.S. history class as part of a unit on the Vietnam War. So one thing I will say, this is a much longer chapter than the others we've read so far. It's going to be 20 pages. This is a chapter that students often tend to get tired just from the reading. I mean, it's not hard reading, but a lot happens in this chapter, and 20 pages is long, considering that the two right before it were just a few pages each. So I'm going to mark in here places where you could take a rest if you're reading. I also think that teachers should consider potentially reading some of this out loud in class because honestly, it is, I think, the most beautiful chapter in this story. The Rainy River is a real place. It's a river that is on the border of Minnesota and Canada. In fact, one of my children who lives up in Minnesota took his family camping last summer, and I could see that they were like near the Rainy River, and I immediately thought of this book, and I remember texting him and saying, "Oh my gosh, you're on the Rainy River." Like, it's just like they were literally where this story or chapter happens. So it's narrated by Tim O'Brien, and right away it does grab our attention. This is one story I've never told before, not to anyone, not to my parents, my brother or sister, even my wife. To go into it, I've always thought would only cause embarrassment for all of us. So this is a confession for sure. And I do think that there are a lot of things that we can relate to in this chapter. Even now, I'll admit the story makes me squirm. For more than 20 years, I've had to live with it, feeling the shame, trying to push it away. And so by this act of remembrance, by putting the facts down on paper, I'm hoping to relieve at least some of the pressure on my dreams. So just I think it is helpful to try and make a connection as a reader to this. Everybody has something that they've done in their past that makes them ashamed of their behavior. And sometimes teachers will have students write journals about that or write it on a piece of paper and seal it up in an envelope and sort of make a wall of shame. I've seen that as a part of a lesson for this chapter. So it's something very relatable, I feel. This is a universal truth. Everybody has moments in their life where they're like, oh my gosh, why on earth did I do that? It goes on to say it's a hard story to tell, and it happens in the summer of 1968. And he has imaginings of like what kind of person he is. He talks about the fact that he likes to think of himself as a courageous person. He had just graduated from college. These could definitely be quiz questions. He went to Macalester College, and he was drafted a month after graduating. It says here that he believed courage comes to us in finite quantities, like an inheritance. And by being frugal and stashing it away and letting it earn interest, we steadily increase our moral capital in preparation for the day that the account must be drawn down. This is something that he kind of believed at that time. It was a comforting theory. It dispensed with all the bothersome little acts of daily courage. It offered hope and grace to the repetitive coward. It justified the past while amortizing the future. So he's acknowledging that, like, as a young, 21, 22-year-old, he was afraid of things. I mean, that's natural, right? So he graduates and he is drafted, and he also is very much against the war. I mean, not to the point where he's out protesting, but he definitely doesn't agree with the war. And I have a note here that this is a lot of historical reference. I'm not going to go into all of this, but I do want you to remember that a lot of times you'll find in high school that your English teacher will teach this book right around the same time that the U.S. history classes are studying the Vietnam War. So you are going to get a lot of historical references here. about the USS Maddox, the Gulf of Tonkin, Ho Chi Minh, all these various things that were happening during this time. So he says that while he was in school, he really did intellectually disagree with the war. He also says that, back in college, I had taken a modest stand against the war, nothing radical, no hothead stuff, just ringing a few doorbells for Gene McCarthy. Remember, Gene McCarthy was the person who started sort of like capitalized on the Red Scare. And we had all those people that were being accused of communists. The McCarthy era was part of this time. It was almost entirely an intellectual activity, though. I brought some energy to it, of course, but it was the energy that accompanies almost any abstract endeavor. I felt no personal danger. I felt no sense of an impending crisis in my life, which I think is interesting because they still had the draft. And so any young man, I think, should have been feeling a potential crisis that they could be drafted, especially because this war had gone on already for, since 1955 or something. So the draft notice arrives on June 17th, 1968. He describes the day as humid, typical sort of afternoon. He remembers the sound in my head. It wasn't thinking, it was just a silent howl. A million things all at once. I was too good for this war, too smart, too compassionate, too everything. And these are all of the things he had sort of earned as a college student: Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude, president of the student body, and a full ride scholarship for grad studies at Harvard. Okay, now that is a huge accomplishment. So I can imagine him thinking he's too good for this war if he has accomplished that already. No mistake. He thinks maybe like it was an accident, they had made a paperwork error. I was no soldier. I hated Boy Scouts. I hated camping out. I hated dirt and tents and mosquitoes. The sight of blood made me queasy, and I couldn't tolerate authority, and I didn't know a rifle from a slingshot. I was a liberal. If they needed fresh bodies, why not draft some back to the Stone Age hawk, or some dumb jingo in his hard hat and bomb Hanoi button, or one of LBJ's pretty daughters? I mean, this is racist and crude, but he's so pissed off. He's like, how can this be? I remember the rage in my stomach. Later, it burned down to a smoldering self-pity. At dinner one night, his father asked what his plans were, and he says, nothing. Wait. So I made here's my squiggly line. This indicates that if you wanted to take a break in reading, this is a good spot to do it because there's a shift now in the story. So then he goes on to talk about what he's doing in the summer of 1968. This is very ironic considering he's going to go off to Vietnam eventually. He was working in an Armour Meat Packing plant in his hometown of Worthington, Minnesota. So this is where the narrator is living. So just remember, even though Tim O'Brien, who's the author of this book, is the name of the person who's narrating the story, it does not mean that everything in here is true. So just keep reminding yourself, the narrator lives in Worthington, Minnesota. The plant specialized in pork products, and for 8 hours he stood on a quarter-mile assembly line removing blood clots from the necks of dead pigs. Okay, that is absolutely disgusting. And he just talked about in the previous page that he hates the sight of blood. So this is not what I imagine a recent college grad doing. But this is what he's doing for the summer as a local business. And a lot of people work there. His actual title was Declotter. This could be a quiz question. To remove the blood, he would use a water gun, a very heavy 80 pounds suspended from the ceiling by a rubber cord. And he would use this to shoot this high pressured water at this cut open pig and get all the blood clots out. It was not pleasant work, which is definitely an understatement. Goggles were a necessity and a rubber apron. Even so, it was like standing for 8 hours a day under a lukewarm blood shower. At night, I'd go home smelling of pig, and it wouldn't go away. Even after a hot bath, scrubbing hard, the stink was always there, like old bacon or sausage. It was tough getting dates that summer. I felt isolated. I spent a lot of time alone, and there was that draft notice tucked away in my wallet. And then he talks about how in the evenings he'd sometimes take the car and just go driving. feeling sorry for himself, how his life seemed to be collapsing towards slaughter, which is the first thing I thought when I read what he was doing, and we know he goes to war. I felt paralyzed. All around me, the options seemed to be narrowing. There was no happy way out. The government had ended most graduate school deferments. So these are the reasons why he really has to go. The waiting list for the National Guard and the reserves were impossibly long, which would obviously be a lot less intense way to be serving in the military. My health was solid. I didn't qualify for conscientious objector. That's what that stands for, status. He had no religious grounds or history as a pacifist. Moreover, I could not claim to be opposed to the war as a matter of general principle, because there were occasions when he did believe a nation was justified in using military force, like to stop a Hitler, for example. The problem, though, was that a draft board did not let you choose your war. Of course not. Beyond all this is the heart of it, and I think even young men and women who enlist in the military or go to military academies feel this way frequently while they're serving. I did not want to die. Not ever, but certainly not then, not there, not in a wrong war. So as he's driving around, he imagines himself dead. He imagines doing things I could not do, like charging an enemy position, taking aim at another human being. This is the reality. At some point in mid-July, I began thinking seriously about Canada. The border was only a few hundred miles north, an 8-hour drive. Both my conscience and my instincts were telling me to make a break for it, to just take off and run like hell and never stop. So he starts to really think about what that would look like. He would be in a hotel room in Winnipeg. He would have a battered old suitcase. He can imagine his father's eyes as he tried to justify it over the phone. He could almost hear his voice and his mother's. Run, I'd think, and then I'd think impossible, and then I'd think run. So he's flip-flopping back and forth, like he just doesn't want to go, of course, right? So it was a moral split. I couldn't make up my mind. I feared the war. I also feared exile. What he means here is social exile, like exile from his family, exile from his community that would think he was wrong. Also just exile because you're not in your country anymore. I feared losing the respect of my parents. I feared the law. I feared ridicule and censor. My hometown was a conservative little spot on the prairie, a place where tradition counted, and it was easy to imagine people sitting around a table and talking about him, like, how that sissy had taken off to Canada. And so he would lay awake, arguing with himself. What should he do? He would imagine himself sort of arguing with the people in town who might judge him. He would say, how do you so quickly judge me? Your blind, thoughtless, automatic acquiescence to it all, meaning the war. Your simple-minded patriotism, prideful ignorance, love it or leave it platitudes. He imagines this is what society is, and so he starts to blame society. I held them, meaning society, personally and individually responsible for the fact that there's even this problem for him. The polyester Kiwanis boys, the merchants and farmers, the pious churchgoers, the chatty housewives, the PTA, the Lions Club. They didn't know Baudet from the Man in the Moon. They didn't know history. They're ignorant to what's happening in Vietnam. And of course, partly this is true because the government sort of censored what was put on television for quite a while. No matter, it was a war to stop the communists, plain and simple. That's what people hung on to, which was how they liked things. And you were a treasonous pussy if you had second thoughts about killing or dying for plain and simple reasons. So this is what he is up against, he believes. He was bitter. He felt sickness inside of him, like a real disease. And he does say, most of this I've told before or hinted at, but what I've never told is the full truth. So here is the full truth, how I cracked, how at work one morning, standing on the pig line, I felt something break open in my chest. I don't know what it was, but it was real. I took off my apron and walked out of the plant and drove home. When he gets home, there's no one in the house. It's mid-morning. And he tries to hold himself together. He takes a hot shower. He packs a suitcase. He writes a very brief note to his parents that just says, taking off, will call, love, Tim. So here's another spot. If you want to take a break from the reading, you could, because you'll be able to remember what just happened. And now we have another little shift to what he does next. He drives north. And the way he feels is giddy, except he also knows there's something impossible about it. And this is a wonderful simile, like running a dead-end maze, no way out. It couldn't come to a happy conclusion regardless. It was pure flight, fast and mindless. He has no plan. He heads straight west and along the Rainy River, which separates Minnesota from Canada, and which for me separated one life from another. The land is mostly wilderness even today. Here and there I passed a motel or a bait shop, but otherwise the country unfolded in great sweeps of pine and birch and sumac. Though it was still August, the air already had the smell of October. So up in Minnesota, that far north, winter comes very quickly, and spring takes a long time to come. I think it's like end of May sometimes. You're still waiting for spring that far north. And it was already feeling chilly. So for a while, he just drives, not aiming at anything. And then in the late morning, I began looking for a place to lie low for a day or two. I was exhausted and scared sick, and around noon, I pulled into an old fishing resort called the Tip Top Lodge. This could also be a quiz question. Not a lodge at all. It's just like a little fishing resort where they have like little cabins, and fishermen and stuff, probably in the wintertime too. Sometimes maybe places like that rent cabins to people who want to ice fish or who want to go snowmobiling. So it's this old little sort of resort, and there's one guy there. The man who opened that door that day is the hero of my life. So this is the man who runs the Tip Top Lodge. And he says here, how do I say this without sounding sappy? Blurt it. Oopsie. Out. The man saved me. He offered exactly what I needed without questions, no judging, without any words at all. He took me in. He was there at a critical time, a silent, watchful presence. So this man was a witness to Tim O'Brien's crisis. 6 days later, when it ended, I was unable to find a proper way to thank him, and I never have. And so if nothing else, this story represents gratitude, 20 years overdue. Even after 2 decades, I can close my eyes and return to the porch of the Tip Top Lodge. I can see that old guy staring at me, Elroy Birdall. So this is a new character, 81 years old, skinny and shrunken and mostly bald. He wore a flannel shirt and brown work pants. I'm absolutely certain that old man took one look and went right to the heart of things, a kid in trouble. So he recognized that something was up with Tim O'Brien. When I asked for a room, he made a clicking sound with his tongue. He nodded and led me to one of the cabins and dropped a key in my hand. I remember smiling at him and wishing I hadn't. The old man shook his head as if to tell me it wasn't worth the bother. Dinner at 5:30, he said. You eat fish? Anything, I said. And Elroy says, I'll bet. Here's another spot if you want to take a little break. We spent 6 days together at the Tip Top Lodge, just the two of us. Tourist season was over. There were no boats on the river. The wilderness seemed to withdraw into a great permanent stillness. Over those 6 days, Elroy Birdall and I took most of our meals together. In the morning, we sometimes went out on long hikes in the woods. And at night, we played Scrabble or listened to records or sat reading in front of his big stone fireplace, which is interesting. He literally just takes him in, and there's no talking about it. At times I felt the awkwardness of an intruder, but Elroy accepted me into his quiet routine without fuss or ceremony. He took my presence for granted the same way he might have sheltered a stray cat. There was never any talk about it. What I remember more than anything is the man's willful, almost ferocious silence, and all that time together, he never asked the obvious question, which was why I was there and why alone, so preoccupied. But I'm sure he already knew. I mean, look where he lives, at the border of Canada, and it's a Vietnam War when a lot of people are burning draft cards and they don't want to fight. Elroy Birdall is also smart. He had all kinds of books and newspapers. He was excellent at Scrabble. So he's clearly up on the news. One evening, just at sundown, he pointed up at an owl circling over the violet-lighted forest to the west and said, "Hey, O'Brien, there's Jesus." The man was sharp. He didn't miss much. Those razor eyes. Now and then I'd catch him staring out the river at the far shore, and I could almost hear the tumblers clicking in his brain. He knew I was in desperate trouble, and he knew I couldn't talk about it. So he describes again how it feels to be that conflicted, where his skin feels too tight. Sometimes he threw up at night. He would just break out in sweats. He's so anxious about the reality of what he might be doing. There were times I thought I'd gone off a psychic edge. Sometimes he would hallucinate, sort of bizarre pictures going through his head, getting chased by the border patrol, imagining just all the things that could go wrong. 21 years old, an ordinary kid with all the ordinary dreams, and all I wanted was to live the life I was born to, a mainstream life. I loved baseball and hamburgers and cherry Cokes, and now I was on the margins of exile, leaving my country forever, and it seemed so grotesque and terrible and sad. This is an example of how people boldly say they're going to do something, and then they realize what it means, and it's so much more complicated than a person imagines. So a couple times, Elroy asks Tim to give him a hand with some of the things that need to be done to shut those cabins down for the winter. So he does. He splits firewood, he stacks it, he does some basic work. I'm sure the old man would have talked about everything except those extra arms and heads. He's talking here about just all the things that, he's having him do. And he's like, the problem had gone beyond discussion. The whole time they're working together, be perfect time to have conversations maybe, but he never brings it up. During that long summer, I'd been over and over the various arguments, all the pros and cons, and it was no longer a question that could be decided by an act of pure reason. Intellect had come up against emotions. My conscience told me to run, but some irrational and powerful force was resisting, like a weight pushing me toward the war. What it came down to, stupidly, was a sense of shame. So there's that word again. So hot, stupid shame. I did not want people to think badly of me. I was ashamed to be there at the Tip-Top Lodge. I was ashamed of my conscience, ashamed to be doing the right thing. So I also just wanted to point out here that he mentions that people in Minnesota in general are very polite. And this is very true. There is a phrase about Minnesota nice. It's real. People in Minnesota are very kind. It says here that Elroy Birdall's reticence was typical of that part of Minnesota where privacy still held value. And even if I'd been walking around with some horrible deformity, 4 arms and 3 heads or whatever, the man would never have said anything about those deformities. It's just being polite. So part of it is that. But I think we can also assume that part of Elroy's silence here is because he doesn't, maybe he doesn't feel like, he knows him well enough. Maybe he thinks that what's best for Tim, which is probably the truth, is that he just needs time, So he's a wise man and he's deferring to silence so that he doesn't screw it up and make something worse that is already potentially pretty bad. Although the old man never confronted me, there was one occasion when he came close to forcing the whole thing out in the open. Excuse me. So they start talking about how long he's going to stay and how much money it costs. He never has asked how much Elroy charges for someone to stay in those cabins. So one night after supper, Tim asks him how much he owes so far. And so he kind of Elroy goes through the general cost, like it's $50 a night usually, not counting meals. You've already been here 4 nights. So Tim O'Brien only has a little over $300 in his wallet. This could be a quiz question. Not very much money for leaving the country. Elroy says, now that's an on-season price. To be fair, I should knock it down because it's off-season. What do you figure is a good price? Because he doesn't know. He's trying to work with Tim because he knows he doesn't probably have much money. And Tim says 40 a night. And he's like, sure. Yeah, and then we can tack on food and 260 total. And Tim says, I guess, which would not leave him very much money at all. And Elroy picks up on that, and he's like, oh, too much? And Tim's like, no, that's fine, but I should leave tomorrow, because otherwise he won't have any money left. And Elroy shrugs and begins to clear the table. And then he says, you know what we forgot? We forgot wages. All those odd jobs you've done. How much did you make an hour at your old job? And Tim says, well, not enough. And then he tells Elroy about working at the pig plant. And Elroy laughs and says, when you first showed up, I wondered about that smell. Like you had been eating a lot of pork chops. He's like, yeah. So they'd settle on $15 an hour for what work Tim has done around the resort. And he's like, actually, I owe you money. And he takes $200 out of his pocket and lays it on the table. And he says, call it even. And Tim says, no. He doesn't want to take any money from him. I'm sure he would just like to say, let's not have any payment at all. And he says, please take it, get yourself a haircut, kind of a joke. And he leaves it on the table, and Tim goes back to his cabin. And the next morning, that money is taped to the door in an envelope, and it says emergency fund. So the man knew. Of course he does. He's like, you need money. So here's another spot you could take a break. And then we're going to have the last few pages here. So he says, looking back at this time, 20 years later, he wonders if it didn't happen in some other dimension where your life exists before you've lived it and where it goes afterwards. None of it ever seemed real. It is kind of like in this weird fog of unreality when you think about where he is out in the middle of nowhere with this man who is just the right person at the right time. This is where you kind of wonder, where is the fictionalizing happening, So one night, he remembers him sitting at Elroy Birdall's dock near dusk. The sky is shimmering pink. He's finishing up a letter to his parents to tell them what he's doing. And he asks in that letter not to be angry with him. He tries to explain his feelings, but there aren't enough words. At the end of the letter, he talks about vacations they used to take. They used to go to Whitefish Lake and how the scenery there was similar to, just what it's like where he is at the Rainy River. I tell them I'm fine. I tell them I'll write again from Winnipeg or Montreal or wherever I end up. And then on my last full day, the 6th day, the old man took me fishing on the Rainy River. So this is just, I don't know, I just get goosebumps every time I read this. It's just so beautifully written. So he takes him out fishing. And the whole time, again, Elroy never talks. For a time, I didn't pay attention to anything, just feeling the cold spray against my face. But then it occurred to me that at some point, we must have passed into Canadian waters, across that dotted line between two different worlds. And I remember a sudden tightness in my chest as I looked up and watched the far shore come at me. This wasn't a daydream. Elroy cut the engine, letting the boat fishtail lightly about 20 yards offshore. The old man didn't look at me or speak. He opens his tackle box and starts to fish. It struck me he must have planned it. I'll never be certain, but I think he meant to bring me up against the realities, to guide me across the river, and to take me to the edge, and to stand a kind of vigil as I chose a life for myself. Again, a witness. I remember staring at the old man, and then at my hands, and then at Canada. It was that close, 20 yards. I could see the delicate lattice work of the leaves, the texture of the soil. I could have jumped and started swimming for my life. Inside me, in my chest, I felt a terrible squeezing pressure. Even now, as I write this, I can still feel that tightness, and I want you to feel it. So he's reaching out to us as readers. He's talking directly to us. The wind coming off the river, the waves, the silence, the wooded frontier. You're at the bow of a boat on the rainy river. You're 21 years old. You're scared, and there's a hard squeezing pressure in your chest. What would you do? This is a great question to think about for yourself. Would you jump? Would you feel pity for yourself? Would you think about your family and your childhood and your dreams and all you're leaving behind? Would it hurt? Would it feel like dying? Would you cry as I did? So he tries to swallow it back, but he can't. What embarrasses me much more and always will is the paralysis that took my heart. A moral freeze. I couldn't decide. I couldn't act. I couldn't comport myself with even a pretense of modest human dignity. All I could do was quietly cry with chest chokes. Elroy pretended not to notice. He kept humming a soft, monotonous little tune. And what was so sad, I realized, was that Canada had become a pitiful fantasy. I understood that I would not do what I should do. I would not swim away from my hometown and my country and my life. I would not be brave, which is ironic. It takes bravery to go to war. It takes bravery not to go to war. I felt a sudden swell of helplessness come over me, a drowning sensation as if I had toppled overboard and was being swept away by the silver waves. I saw a 7-year-old, so he starts to see pictures of himself, like growing up, when he was 7 years old, when he was 12 years old, when he was 16 years old. His whole life kind of runs before his eyes like a movie. He also imagines all the people in town like cheering for him, like jump, swim, or don't, come back and go to the war. He imagines them rooting him on, a loud stadium roar. There's hot dogs and popcorn and all kinds of cheerleaders and a band and everything else. They were all whooping and chanting and urging me toward one shore or the other. He sees it like it's a game. I saw faces from my distant past and distant future. My wife, my unborn daughter waved at me. My 2 sons hopped up and down. So here's like fictionalizing to some degree. A drill sergeant named Blyson sneered and shot up a finger and shook his head. There was a choir in bright purple robes. So I have a note here. This is how stories become stories. Like we're taking like a story he's writing and it's like transforming. It's changing as he writes it. Like obviously he didn't know he had an unborn daughter and 2 sons when he was first experiencing this, but as a writer now telling the story, he's adding these details. The boat is rocking beneath him. And I have it written here, past and present is coming together. That's kind of tucked in there. It's hard to see. He tries to will himself overboard. He tries to say like, now, jump, right? And he can't. He imagines them yelling that he's a traitor, that he's a turncoat. He realizes that he's just embarrassed. I couldn't make myself be brave. It had nothing to do with morality. Embarrassment is all it was. I would go to the war. I would kill and maybe die because I was embarrassed not to. Now he's really crying. Still, Elroy is quiet. He kept fishing. He worked his line with the tips of his fingers. His eyes were flat and impassive. He didn't speak. He was simply there, like the river and the late summer sun, and yet by his presence, his mute watchfulness, he made it real. He was the true audience. He was a witness like God or like the gods who look on us in absolute silence as we live our lives, as we make our choices or fail to make them. So I do think a good question is to ask, what is the value of a witness? It's a good thing to discuss. Why do we see a witness so often in literature? We have it in Gatsby. The eyes of T.J. Eckelberg, for those of you who've read The Great Gatsby, is a witness, watching over the Valley of Ashes. In this book, Elroy is a witness at this very important moment. And then, just out of the blue, Elroy says, "Ain't biting," which I thought was funny, because not only are the fish not biting, but Tim O'Brien isn't biting at the opportunity to swim away either. And so he pulls up his line and he turns the boat back towards Minnesota. I don't remember. So here's another shift, I guess, if you needed it, but I only have one more page left. I don't remember saying goodbye. That last night we had dinner together. I went to bed early, and in the morning, Elroy fixed breakfast for me. When I told him I'd be leaving, the old man nodded as if he already knew. He looked down at the table and smiled. At some point later in the morning, it's possible that we shook hands. I don't remember. But I do know that by the time I'd finished packing, the old man had disappeared. Around noon, when I took my suitcase out to the car, I noticed that his old black pickup truck was no longer in the front of the main lodge. I went inside and waited for a while, but I felt a bone certainty that he wouldn't be back. In a way, I thought it was appropriate. So that's a why. I'm not answering that question. I'm just asking you to ask it. I washed up the breakfast dishes, left his $200 on the kitchen counter, got into the car, and drove home. The day was cloudy. I passed through towns with family names, through the pine forests and down to the prairie, and then to Vietnam, where I was a soldier, and then home again. I survived, but it's not a happy ending. I was a coward. I went to the war.